Really happy to be here today to share with you all different aspects of my research as it relates to plant conservation. That's something I'm really passionate about, and really excited to share with you all today. So just to give you a little bit of an outline on where I'm going. First, I'm just going to give a little bit of background on the California flora. This is the place in which I do my work, and I consider myself to be a place-based botanist. I'm a person from California, and I really strongly feel that the work I do sort of has helped me land deeper roots in this place where I've called home for my entire life. And it's just a wonderful flora that I love to share. With everyone I talk to, I have to talk about how amazing the California flora is. I'll talk a little bit about different aspects of my research and how I utilize these different sort of angles of botanical research to address plant conservation questions or to advance conservation for plants. And then as I tie it up, I'll kind of lean into or kind of discuss how these areas of research have kind of like funneled towards botanical advocacy in relation to communication and legal efforts to strengthen protection for plants. So the California flora, so at the beginning of a manual, it's called the Jepson Manual, which is the primary manual we use to identify plants in California. There's a foreword to this book by a woman named Connie Millar. She's an incredible scientist who studies conifers in montane regions in California. And she writes this wonderful introduction giving this incredible background on the California flora, looking at it from a paleo perspective to a modern perspective. And she has this sentence in there, which for me really encapsulates sort of this, the complexity and sort of interesting facets of the California flora and why it's so diverse and amazing. And this sort of is that sentence that encapsulates it, that it is this complex expression of geology, climate, and increasingly disproportionate human influence. And so that sort of last part really brings about sort of our efforts for conservation and I guess the urgency surrounding that, because it is this very heterogeneous, diverse, complex region that supports incredible plant diversity, yet it also supports a burgeoning and just continually growing population. I live in Los Angeles County, which is the most populous state in the United States, and so it's a lot to kind of contend with and think about how we advance sort of like the population will continue to grow, but there are ways to support biodiversity while also maintaining our human lives. So this map really demonstrates sort of this sort of heterogeneous environment in California. It's a climate map that shows the different climate zones in California. And you could replace this map then also with a geology map and a topography map, and you'd see just as much incredible diversity across the state. But one of the things that I think that is so important and special about California that has led to this incredible diversity in plant species is that it's a Mediterranean climate region, and it's one of only 5 in the world. And when you look at all the Mediterranean climate regions together, they all constitute these biodiversity hotspots, or these regions with high species richness and lots of high rates of endemism. So a high proportion of species that occur only there and no place else in the world. And the thing that is interesting about Mediterranean climates is that they're dominated by winter precipitation, and they're characterized by these prolonged droughts in the summertime. So just imagine being just imagine being a plant, and in your life, you have to deal with experiencing the hottest months with 0 precipitation, like no rain coming, and it's very, very hot. So plants have created all these sort of adaptation strategies to deal with this prolonged summer drought. And so we have lots of diverse, life histories, high percentage of annual plants, which are evading drought, right, by living their summertime in the soil seed bank as a seed, or being succulent, or, you know, losing your leaves in the summertime. So we have a lot of drought deciduous species. So this Mediterranean climate really, I think, has precipitated, you know, incredible diversity in California. So we have in California over 6,600 taxa or kinds of plants in the state. That's incredible high diversity. It's the most species rich state in the United States. It's in part due to our size. We are a large state, but it is disproportionate when you compare it to other large states such as Texas and Alaska. And over a third of those species only occur in California and nowhere else in the world. And a high proportion of those are also rare. So over 2,400 plants we categorize as rare in some form, and we track them in an inventory and sort of are working to advance conservation efforts for those species. And I mentioned all these different life history strategies we have, you know, in California to deal with this prolonged summer drought, you know, as they experience the Mediterranean climate. And so when you look at life forms in California, you see that the majority of the species are herbaceous. They're either herbaceous perennials or a high percentage are annual species, 31%. When you look at I study a lot of species in the desert. When you look at the desert alone, upwards of over 50% of the species richness are these annual plants. So this is like a high proportion of diversity that is oftentimes dormant at certain times of the month. So they're not always present. So they can be really hard to track and, you know, kind of monitor, especially in very dry years, which we've been experiencing a lot of in California, a lot of incredibly dry years. And then we look at the life forms for rare plants, we see pretty much the same thing. Like the rare plants sort of mirror what we find throughout the state in terms of life form. And I think then it's no wonder that I actually like have a strong affinity for these herbaceous taxa, because I am a person studying rare plants, but a high proportion of them are these herbaceous perennials or annuals. Oops. So you know, California is, you know, is this place of great richness, and we have really had the opportunity to lead in plant conservation. There's a ton of resources in California to advance plant conservation, and we have more land under protection than any other state in the lower 48 states. And despite all this effort towards conservation, we are still home to the highest concentration of imperiled species outside of protected areas. So despite having sort of lots of momentum and energy and policy towards conservation, there's still a lot of work to do. So we continue on, and, you know, we have a lot to do to advance conservation of these species. And I do plant conservation at the California Botanic Garden. And the California Botanic Garden has been around since 1927. And I do that through sort of all the resources that we have at the garden, and of which we have many. And so we have a herbarium of over 1.2 million specimens. We have the largest seed bank dedicated to California native plants. So this is sort of a safety net to conserve plants, you know, to provide a safety net in the event of local extinction or potentially total extinction in the wild, where we have genetic material sort of saved away as sort of a Noah's Ark, you know, of biodiversity. And then we have our living collection on 86 acres, which really allows us to interact with the public and provide the opportunity to educate the public on native plants, because really you need broader public support, understanding, and buy-in to really advance these conservation efforts. So I feel like working at a botanic garden is this really great opportunity to advance these initiatives and to utilize all the incredible resources that we have to apply them on the landscape. And when our institution was established, so our founder, her name was Susanna Bixby Bryant. She established the institution in 1927, and she really had conservation very much at the center of what our work was, to encompass. And that's because this picture in the landscape, this is Los Angeles in 1929. And this is what she was seeing on the landscape, as she was seeing rapid urbanization happening in this region, just total landscape level change. And, we think about all the, that we're living in the midst of the climate crisis, the biodiversity extinction crisis, and everything all it feels very consequential. But you could imagine if this area that was, full of incredible diversity, if you lived in this area at the time and just saw just this rapid change happening in the environment, you would be very alarmed and feel the need to do something to advance these conservation initiatives. So she set out to create this institution dedicated to native plants, and her words back then guide me today, which is to preserve the native flora and try to replenish the depleted supply of some of the rarest plants, which are rapidly being exterminated. So that's still very central to the work that we do today. And so here we are today, and we're experiencing these twin crises of, biodiversity crisis, climate crisis, and really these are two sides of the same coin. The climate crisis has been essentially created in part due to, like the creation of Los Angeles is one of rapid urbanization and paving landscapes, which allow us to spew carbon in the atmosphere and industrialize, our environment, which has precipitated the climate crisis, which then further exacerbates the biodiversity crisis, because now we have prolonged drought, we're having increased fire frequency, we're having all these impacts, which are now, it's here and now that we're seeing the impacts of climate change to species. So I'm going to talk about this later in my presentation, but we need to rapidly decarbonize and advance those initiatives, but we need to do that in a way that doesn't then further exacerbate the biodiversity crisis, which we're kind of experiencing sort of rollouts which have the potential to do potentially more harm than good. And so it's something we really need to be aware of and sort of sound the alarm on. And I'll talk about that more later in my presentation. So there's this really great paper that Wesley Knapp and others put out where he really examined plant extinctions across the United States to examine sort of what have been the causes of extinctions, and sort of what are the patterns of plant extinction in the United States. And so in examining this, they documented 65 confirmed plant extinctions for which they could confidently say, occurred. There are, of course, potentially occurred many what we call dark extinctions, which are extinctions that happened before they were actually able to be documented. And so we know that, there was sort of modification of the landscape for some time without, having sort of documented these plant species by museum specimens or whatnot, that we don't necessarily know what was lost because maybe oral traditions had also been lost. So this is just what has been documented. And the majority of those extinctions happened in California. And the habitat alteration is and continues to remain the leading cause of extinction. And here is a picture from this year, satellite imagery from this year of a landscape of, wildflowers. Many of you may have heard of the super bloom. That occurred in California, which is just like these sort of endless landscapes covered in wildflowers. And there was a lot of press and media about the super bloom. And so this satellite imagery is intended to depict the the super bloom, but you see it in this matrix of modified landscape of solar panels and housing and other sorts of infrastructure. And so it just sort of, I think, shows or is indicative of the complexity of the landscapes that we have today, and especially when we think about climate change and the need for organisms to migrate. And there's all these things they need to contend with, right, out there in this very complex landscape that we've created. So I am I'm a botanist who works on plant conservation, and in doing that, I utilize various tools in my toolbox. And so I'm going to kind of talk about some of these today, and give different case studies and examples of how we utilize these sort of research tools or applied tools to advance plant conservation. And that includes various forms of research. It could also include seed banking, restoration, monitoring, like these more on the ground activities. And I won't have a chance to go into all the on the ground activities we do at the Botanic Garden. I'm going to focus a little bit more on some of the lines of research that I've participated in and how you can make sure to leverage the results of those research so that they are useful in conservation efforts, and then show how I've then pivoted towards advocacy and outreach. So the fundamental sort of like the foundation of my research is really in plant documentation utilizing museum specimens. So in plants, that's herbaria. So these are dried press plant specimens that are stored in museums, and they really tell us so much about plant diversity across the world. They let us know sort of the what and where of plant diversity, what plants occur on our planet, where do they occur? And then if we keep up to date with our herbarium specimens, they can tell us a little bit about how they are doing. And so we're still, the herbaria turned out are actually frontiers of discovery, because there are many more species to describe in the world. And it's estimated that half of the world's undescribed species live in herbaria. And so they're there waiting botanists and taxonomists to come and study them so we can reveal them so that we don't have future cases of dark extinction. They also can, because these specimens have been collected for centuries, they could give us a view into, a window to view sort of how plant diversity has changed across time. So we can look at how phenology is changing across time, perhaps in relation to climate change. So these are physical specimens, and they really have sort of untold potential of future research application that we might not even know yet. And these can be coupled with other sorts of observations, like iNaturalist is a very popular database. And so we can link these with, if the botanist is out there collecting physical specimens, they can also collect iNaturalist records and link those records together, and then just make sort of a more full set of data that can be harnessed by folks doing on the ground land management to other researchers, etc. So this is a map of the mapped herbarium specimens in California. You could see, so the areas that are darker have more collections, and areas that are white have an absence of collection. So you can see that there are still many data gaps in California, which is a region that is relatively well collected in our country. And one of the major areas where there's an absence of collection is in our desert region. So this region of California is the desert. And some of that might be related to land management. So there are large military installations, which make it difficult to access those lands for research and collection. Another area where there's absence of collection is our Great Central Valley. The Great Central Valley is quite an ecological tragedy. It was an incredibly rich wetland and it's been completely converted. It is what feeds our country and the world, but it's all agriculture, and those ecosystems have been lost. So there really is a paucity of collections there because the wild plants that live there are, for the most part, now absent because it's been wholly type converted. But there's still this area here is called the Modoc Plateau. This is an area that's rich in species, but very difficult for people to access because it's so remote. So it's an area that may be prioritized for botanical expeditions to sort of help us fully realize like what occurs here. So there's still a lot of work to do. And these bits of information are really essential to conservation because it's really hard to sort of identify areas of priority of conservation if we don't know what actually we're trying to conserve or what occurs there. And so this is very essential baseline information. So one of the lines of research that I participate in is floristic research. And floristic research is basically plant geography research, in which we go to various regions and we collect herbarium specimens, which provides this foundational knowledge on plant diversity. It tells us information on the distribution and abundance of species. It generates these very valuable herbarium specimens. And this line of research is not, it's not as active as I would hope it could be in many areas, but the California Botanic Garden is still very, very active in floristic research. So it is sort of this hub of botanists on the ground gathering this knowledge. And so I hope that we can sort of reinvigorate this line of research because this kind of information is still very much needed. And it's not a science of a prior time. It really is still a science of modern needs for this sort of information as we approach, right, as we're grappling with global change issues. So I just want to kind of showcase some of the projects of my students who participate in floristic research. So Maria Jesus, she graduated from our program in 2021, and she did a floristic study in the Southern Inyo Mountains, which are at the border of Death Valley National Park. When she joined our program, she wanted to conduct a floristic study where the data she utilized could be like directly input into, advanced conservation initiatives. And so I let Maria know that there was a coalition building to try to protect this area because of a proposed gold mine, and that they could really use some botanical data. And so she investigated that area and thought, yes, this is like the perfect study for me. And so she joined this campaign to protect this area from this proposed gold mine, which is still ongoing because the mining company is still proposing gold mining exploration in this region, and is still kind of under environmental review. And so there's still a lot of activity surrounding this proposed project. But in response to this, there's a rare plant that is in the exact area where the gold mine is proposed. And this gold mine would provide existential risk to this species. It's called Peridili inyoensis, or the Inyo rock daisy. So Maria actually prepared a petition to advance this species for listing under both the California and the Federal Endangered Species Act. And just 2 weeks ago, I think it was actually last week, the California Fish and Game Commission actually voted to list the Inyo rock daisy under the Federal Endangered Species Act, under the California Endangered Species Act, as threatened. And so she's had conservation success, and that's just, it's very exciting that Maria, as a master's student, was able to sort of mobilize and sort of join coalitions and have her data utilized towards these very direct conservation efforts. So that is a really great success. And we hope that it will protect this species from this gold mine. A current project that's happening right now is my current student, Perry Lee Pipkin, is undertaking a floristic study in the Silver Peak Range. And this is just in the neighboring state of Nevada. This particular region where she's conducting her floristic study is at the center of what's been called the white gold rush. This is essentially the race to secure lithium, which is really essential, an essential element of batteries, which will be important as we decarbonize, and we need a place to store energy. We need lithium batteries for electric vehicles. So this is very essential. But unfortunately, the efforts to secure lithium is this very unplanned and it's a very the effort is, literally is like, if you learned about the gold rush, right, of the 1800s in California, it was just like whole scale, like people descending upon the landscape to strike it rich, and you just insert lithium instead of gold, and this is what's happening. And while we need this mineral, we also need to do it to secure it in a way that doesn't exacerbate harm, right, or cause extinction, or have very consequential environmental impacts. And so I'm going to talk about two species within Perry Lee's study area that are being impacted by this white gold rush, the race to secure lithium. And one of them is the Tacopa birdspeak. And this is the Tacopa birdspeak. This is a globally rare species that occurs in California and Nevada. So G2 is a rank applied by NatureServe to say that this is imperiled species. It's a species that relies on groundwater, occurs in desert wetlands, and it has many threats, including groundwater extraction for agriculture, off-highway vehicle incursion, cattle grazing, but the proposed lithium extraction is really the most existential threat that has emerged just in the past year. And the Center for Biological Diversity actually just put forth a listing petition to seek legal protection for this species, so that hopefully we don't lose its entire habitat due to the efforts to secure lithium. So when we look at the range of the species, I say it occurs in California and Nevada. There's two sets of populations. There's a set of that are separated by 150 miles. So the northern populations in Fish Lake Valley, these are the ones that we're most concerned about that are under threat. And we're actually doing some taxonomic investigations because, for one, these sets of populations are geographically separated, and there's we've gathered data to indicate that there's morphological differences, there's ecological differences. They occur at very different elevations. They also have very different flowering periods. And so we're conducting genetic research and a common garden study to kind of understand more about the distinctiveness between these sets of populations and whether or not they warrant sort of taxonomic recognition or should be recognized as different subspecies. So when we look at the northern, we're going to zoom into the northern population and examine the threats there. What we find, this is a map of the northern population with the black dots are the Tacopa birdspeak. The entire range is under a lithium mining claim now, and this has emerged just within the past year that people have gone and claimed up all the lands, and they're starting to sell those lands to mining companies. Usually they're international mining companies from Canada or Australia. And there's already lithium exploration happening on the landscape where they've bladed roads and they're actively drilling. So this is emerging very, very fast, a very quickly emerging threat. In addition to the lithium claims, there's geothermal exploration that has popped up that would impact the groundwater supply to the species. So these impacts really have potential for lasting change in this landscape, specifically across Nevada. I'm going to show a map a little later that just shows the scale of the problem, or the scale of like the need for planning, because it is just it's rolling out very fast and in a very uncoordinated fashion. Yeah, so this really constitutes a significant portion of the species range, as it is whether or not they're recognized as two distinct species or subspecies. The threats to this northern population are so significant that we feel that probably, it depends on the analysis of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but it likely qualifies for federal listing based on the threats to the northern part of the range. So we have various ongoing research happening with the Tecopa birdsbeak. Like I mentioned, we're doing taxonomic assessments, which include a phylogenetic study, a population genetic study, and a common garden experiment. And we've also done a lot of very intensive surveys. So that map that I showed you, we gathered all that data prior to working in this area. The species was only known from like a point here and a point here. And the majority of this area was not mapped or really known about. So it's really important to get out on the landscape, do thorough mapping, so you can really understand the scale of threat, to the species. So this is a map that shows what is happening across Nevada and the Great Basin Desert with respect to lithium claims. And so all of these are proposed projects across the landscape. And in particular, the Tecopa birdsbeak lives in this zone, which is sort of the hot spot or hotbed for all these proposed lithium mining projects, and also happens to be a region of like high biodiversity value. And so really there needs to be more sort of landscape level planning to identify areas of least conflict, where we can move projects forward and secure lithium, for the country, for our energy needs, to help us decarbonize, but also then identify areas where there's high conflict for either cultural resources, biodiversity resources, all these sort of things that the agencies really should be analyzing for, to kind of like guide them to either say, yes, we can permit this project, or, oh, this is actually a really bad project, we should not permit this project. So the scale of this is pretty vast and it's rapid. And so it's pretty alarming. And there's not as much botanical capacity in Nevada as there is in California. So that's why some of my students, we've kind of leaned into or entered into Nevada, because there really is a paucity of information, and we need to like bring forth a greater understanding to hopefully prevent extinctions. So next I'll move, that was kind of like a prelude to initiating taxonomic work, but I wanted to present some taxonomic work that's already been completed. And that's in my work of monkey flowers. So that's how I've known Carrie for a while, but I got to know Carrie a little more because we have monkey flowers in common. But they're a very species-rich group in California. And you can see here, this is just an example of some of the floral diversity you see across the family. And they're just incredibly gorgeous. And also they're very sensitive to disturbance. And a high proportion of these species are rare. So this is what kind of drew me into this group, was my interest in rarity, endemism, conservation, and that fact that this group is rich in species where I live and has a high proportion of rare plants. So over the course of my dissertation research, I actually described 5 species that hadn't been previously described. So these 2 species over here to the right, these were recognized, the Erythranthe palmeri and Erythranthe montuoides. And I described these 5 species here on the left. This one here, Erythranthe calcicola, has 2 color morphs for its flowers, yellow and white. So that's why there's 2 flowers there. But basically they were kind of, there was like a generic pink form and a generic yellow form and a bunch of things sort of lumped in. And so then how did I go about and decide or identify that these were indeed distinct species worthy of recognition? And so I'm going to just kind of give a little bit of background specifically on Erythranthe carcinensis, because it has a very It has a conservation story that goes along with it, and its conservation story is still evolving. And I'm still working on this species. So Erythranthe carcinensis was previously included or lumped in with the Erythranthe montuoides. I did gather molecular data. This is just a phylogenetic tree from ITS, but what it shows is that Erythranthe carcinensis resolves, all the samples I collected resolved as a clade that was highly supported, and separate from a clade that resolved of all the Erythranthe montuoides specimens. So these are two distinct lineages. We don't know exactly how they're related to one another because that's unresolved, but we do have evidence that they resolve as separate monophyletic lineage. So they're reciprocally monophyletic. And I gathered all sorts of other data. So we have some molecular evidence to show that these are distinct lineages, but then also I went out on the ground and found that they had different ecological contexts. So Erythranthe carcinensis occurs in the desert in sagebrush scrub. Erythranthe montuoides occurs at high elevation in the Sierra Nevada in lodgepole pine forest at the edge of meadows. So they have very different ecologies. But then also, so Erythranthe carcinensis is in the desert here in Carson City, but this is like right next to Lake Tahoe and right at the edge of the Sierra Nevada. And when I had done my study, no one had ever really mapped these points before. And there was just sort of this idea that, oh, this was a species that occurred in the Sierra Nevada, and maybe, I think there was this idea that maybe it had this distribution that went from here, all the way down south. But once I mapped them, you can see that there's these very distinct breaks. There's a lot of geographic separation between these species, and great elevational differences. So they have different distributions, they have different ecologies, and they're also morphologically distinct. So I also measured morphological traits and was able to describe the distinct morphologies. You might look at them and say, well, I don't know, these are both kind of little yellow monkey flowers. But here, Erythranthe montuoides, you can see each lobe, this is one of the differences. Each lobe is entire, whereas here you can see Erythranthe carcinensis has a bifid lobe, and it always has these like a more pronounced red dot in the middle, whereas this is more like mottled red. So that's just some of the differences, but they also have vegetative differences. It's just they're very small. And so it's actually kind of, once they're dried and pressed and present on herbarium specimens, it's really hard to distinguish them physically when they're on the herbarium sheet. So it took a lot of field work and examining them in the field in their habitat to understand that these are indeed different things. So Erythranthe carcinensis was described in 2012. And at that time, when I went to its habitat, it was actually really hard to find. I thought it could have been already extinct. So I looked at all these historical specimens. I wasn't finding any of them. And so I contacted a local botanist who had collected it maybe a decade prior and asked him, I said, I'm trying to relocate this occurrence you collected. I'm not able to find it. It's around development. Is this still extant? And he said, oh no, I remember that trip and I made all those collections because that parcel was going to be developed and it's now like the local Walmart shopping center. So that, that population is extirpated. And so he said, well, let me go out with you in the field because I remember that plant and maybe we can find potential habitat and we could just find new locations where maybe it occurs. So we did that. We did a lot of field work together and we found new locations. But unfortunately, many of the locations that were historically documented were all extirpated. And so the local botanists, they kind of adopted this species and then they did an analysis and found that about 42% of the potential habitat had already been lost to urbanization and agriculture, but they were finding more and more locations. So we had some hope that perhaps these locations that are newly found could be protected. And so I wanted to check on this species again and see how things have been going since I described it in 2012, and found that even more populations I had found during that time have since been extirpated. And this is one of them. I was out there this year, and this is its habitat right here. You could see really nice intact sagebrush scrub. There are plants down here. And then it was actively being bulldozed. So you could see the bulldozer, like we were watching them bulldoze the habitat, like as I was sitting there. So it was just like, well, this is what's happening with the species. So there are populations that are on federal lands, on Bureau of Land Management land and Forest Service land, but it doesn't really have protection there. And so it may warrant listing under the Federal Endangered Species Act to bolster legal protection for this species. Yeah, so there are these newly identified populations of public lands. This is one of them. I'm on public land, but I'm also looking, this is the barrier between public land and private land. And so then you could see there's development here and there are plants here. And so it lives in this sort of matrix of the wildland urban interface. And so even though it's on public lands, there's potentially a lot of impacts, because at the wildland urban interface, so we often see increased wildfire frequency, invasive species coming in. And so there are potentially lots of issues for this species. So it definitely needs more funding and support if we're going to see its continued existence on the landscape. So I think this species for me, like, I have done this, I felt very good about it's like, wow, this research was very impactful because it brought a species to light before it had gone extinct. But revisiting it, 10 years later, seeing that, describing it and having it known about isn't necessarily enough, because there are still emerging impacts to this species. So I've been working in plant conservation now for about 20 years. And I thought, well, how could I increase my contribution to plant conservation to prevent extinctions mediated by human activity. And then I thought, well, I could either get involved in more policy-oriented tasks, perhaps get involved with more endangered species listings, and then also, how can I communicate about this to the public? So that sort of led me to thinking about botanical advocacy. And this species here, Team's buckwheat, was sort of my avenue into investigating or kind of going down this path of botanical advocacy. So I just want to paint the picture for Team's buckwheat, which is a desert species that lives in Nevada, in the same region where the Tecopa birdsbeak lives. It's like the exact same region, but just a different habitat. It's not a wetland species, it's an upland species. And again, there's a proposed lithium boron mine that poses an existential threat to this species. And the mine is called the Rhyolite Ridge Mine. And this is a map. This image kind of depicts their proposed project, and overlaid on that is the buckwheat populations, the global population of the buckwheat. So this is the entire distribution of the buckwheat, are these green blobs here. And then it's recently been listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And in doing that, they designated critical habitat. And the critical habitat is this green hatched buffer here. And so the mining company, they've adjusted their plans a couple of times. So they say to accommodate the buckwheat, and this is their latest plan that they proposed to the government. But it really doesn't do enough, because really they have an open pit mine right here. This quarry is the open pit, and it's a mere 12 feet from the buckwheat. And this is their overburden storage, or their mine tailings. So they have mine tailings and an open pit within the critical habitat of the buckwheat. The critical habitat is identified as being sort of containing the essential elements needed for like the long-term conservation of the species. So you have to consider, right, pollinators, species movement, all these sorts of things to ensure long-term conservation. It's not just the exact area where plants live now. And so really this mining project is at odds with what the Endangered Species Act is supposed to provide. But it's undergoing environmental review right now. So this proposed plan is actively being reviewed by the government to determine if they will permit the project or if they will not permit the project. So it's really critical that we got Endangered Species Act protection for this species in advance of this project review, because without legal protection, there would be by virtue of the 1872 mining law, the government would have to prioritize the mine over the species. The 1872 mining law is very, very robust and strong to promote mining on the landscape and that sort of economic development. And it supersedes everything unless you have another law that can sort of contend with it. And the Endangered Species Act, we hope, is one such law that would provide robust protection for the species. So my venture into botanical advocacy included many different kinds of activities. It's not, so one is I signed on to the Endangered Species Act petition, but then I utilized my scientific knowledge and my botanical skills to provide scientific review and comment on documents that the mining company was putting forth to advance their project. And so I could review and analyze that against like how that would impact the species and how that met, sort of squared off with the needs for plant conservation. And then I did a lot of monitoring. So I kind of went out there monthly to basically investigate what was happening on the landscape, because this species has been in the media a lot, and there's been a lot of people out there and sometimes doing questionable things. So we're just constantly monitoring the species, making sure that it's protected, or that if there's any impacts, we report it to the agencies. I also utilized my network, and I put out calls to scientists to sign on to letters to support this effort to get the species protection. So I requested direct action of other scientists, and I gave a lot of presentations providing public comment on the project. I utilized social media to kind of promote this effort, and then also participated in many media inquiries. And through this work was sort of my first foray into connecting directly with media outlets to, be, I guess, a voice for plants. And I've also written various op-eds. And so I think that's actually been very effective in advancing these conservation campaigns. And to, I think having the voice of a scientist, in these efforts, just adds sort of, the person leading the conservation campaign is more of an advocate. He's frequently in sort of media outlets, but then to also have a scientist in there kind of providing the scientific information or backing for the need to conserve the species, I think was powerful. And so this is, turns out Teams buckwheat is now the most famous buckwheat in the world. It's had many media hits. It's been in CNN and CBS, ABC News. It's been on TV. It's been in print. It's been on radio. This Wired magazine article is a really interesting one to check out. It actually focuses on sort of the people working and supporting the plant and like why it's important to us and why sort of we put ourselves out there on the line to protect a plant species. And I would say, my media 101, like if there's one question I should have down, is the question I get asked from every single media outlet is, why do plants matter? Why should anyone care? And that really kind of breaks my heart that is the most frequently asked questions. I feel like I should put frequently asked questions of a botanist. Why do plants matter? And then have it get my all the different versions of my answer that I've given, and I really need to kind of workshop that. But I think it really speaks to the disconnect we have, humans in our relationship with nature. And it should be ingrained in us, or have that baseline understanding that our world is not possible without plants. And they are everything. They have nourished us, they have housed us, they have provided us with oxygen and medicine through the ages, and they continue to do that now. Just because we live in these more modern societies doesn't mean we're less independent from plants. We are just as intertwined and reliant on plant diversity as we ever have been, and we will be more so even into the future as we think about global climate change and the need potentially to develop new crops and these sorts of things. And those are very utilitarian arguments. And so beyond the utilitarian arguments, we have a special relationship with plants. We are deeply connected with them. And so they say, so it's just this one buckwheat. What does it matter? Then what does anything matter? Why do we care about anything? Why should we allow extinction to be the cost for an electric vehicle? Why can't we find another way, or find new pathways? And so it's something that we get asked about a lot. And so, oops, sorry, my slides are going all over the place. So after the buckwheat phenomenon, and then I was interfacing with all these media outlets, I mentioned the super bloom. This year in California, we had a super bloom, and I had the opportunity to advocate for wildflowers once again, but this time in relation to sort of responsible recreation and thinking about our relationship to the landscape and how we interact with nature while we're recreating, because there's been lots of impacts to annual wildflower fields in California because of the desire to get that perfect Instagram picture, or whatever the desire might be. People are trampling on these landscapes and really causing ecological impact. And this is sort of combined with media outlets sensationalizing the event, and then sort of bringing greater flocks of people to these landscapes that don't have the capacity to sort of properly manage the crowds. So like, how do we allow for a greater population to enjoy nature, because that's what we need, while simultaneously limiting impact? And so it's a very complicated conversation, but at the same time, it's been very interesting because it shows that plants and nature are not these sort of like niche interests, but they really are cultural conversations that we're having across the country. And and that the news will listen. So this is just another example of, this is an article from The Guardian. There was a park that had a poppy of hillsides a little town called Lake Elsinore that no one ever heard of until the super bloom happened there. And these hillsides got covered in poppies, and this little town was inundated with everyone from Los Angeles coming to see the poppies, and people were clogging the freeways and stopping on the freeways to take pictures. And it was very hazardous. There were lots of accidents that were happening. So this town basically shut their town down. They said no one is allowed to come, like the super bloom is closed. And that caused a lot of controversy. And sort of my quote in speaking about that was, I don't think the way forward is to actually cordon off nature. It's not to fence off nature and to prevent people from interacting with nature. And we need to find a way to have basically societal change in our values and how we interact with the landscape, and have an understanding of how our actions can be positive, or we can also have actions that are negative. And humans are not inherently, these bad creatures that shouldn't be in nature. Humans can have great capacity to do wonderful things for nature. We participate in restoration projects. We have whole careers and all these people that are dedicated to like stewarding nature. Like, we are very caring organisms that can have really positive benefit. But we also need to recognize that we can also have very negative impact. And I think we've seen that through human mediated extinctions, the climate crisis, all these things precipitated by our actions. And so it's a matter of our relationship to nature, and how do we re-envision our role and how we interact. And that's like a huge, sort of global shift, conversation. But we, just a couple centuries ago, people had more connection with nature, and so we know that like big societal shifts can happen. So like, how can we re-envision how we interact with diversity? So as I kind of round this out, I just, plant conservation is really many people working together. It's scientists, it's land managers, it's advocates, it's individuals. And we just really need greater funding, public awareness, and I think media messaging really can help in those areas. And then I think a scientist really has a lot of different roles to play, not just in scientific research and data collection, but can also lean into maybe aspects of policy or advocacy, sort of media messaging type things. And so with that, I like to kind of leave, I want to just like leave with this idea that, we think oftentimes like, I work in plant conservation, and I try to like rein myself in, and it's like, I'm not like the plant whisperer who's gonna like save all plants, but I also have to recognize how plants play a role in my life, and how they in themselves, they in a way have agency, right? They have these world making abilities, like they've oxygenated our atmosphere and created opportunities, for us to live our lives. And so I think by recognizing that in plants, it can allow for greater respect for non-human diversity. And that also for us to remember that while we can't be responsible for things that have happened in the past, we are here now, and we can make change in the future, and the future is not yet written. And so I have a lot of hope that we can have change, and we can have some momentum towards conservation. And so I thank you. That's what I have for today.
All right, thank you very much, Nat. We're kind of right up at 1 o'clock, so I know some people may need to run off to class, but we do have time if people are around and have questions. They can either mention to Stacy in the room, or we can put it in chat. We can stick around as needed, or I can also email them to Naomi as needed. Let's see. Hi, Amy, do you have a question?
Hi, Steve, Naomi, thank you so much for sharing that. I do research in Death Valley on soil, so it was just exciting to see more about the region altogether. But I have a question about how you do your monkey flower seeking. I mean, it's a really tiny flower. It doesn't bloom all the time. How do you know when to go out and look for it? Or do you look for the plant without the flower? I mean, how challenging is that?
It's very hard, actually. It's very challenging, and it takes a lot of practice, really. I would say that anyone who hasn't gone out to look for them, if they were to go out for the first time, just sort of blindly and trying, just if they have even good location data, they could easily miss them. And so it just takes some training and time and practice. And then eventually, like I used to joke to say that with my grant funding, I was going to purchase a monkey flower divining rod that was just like guide me to them, because they were so hard to find. But eventually you really just become in tune with the plant, and you learn where to find them, and you also